Good day, everyone, and good day, Miss. We are Group 2, and we are going to talk to you about the economic efficiency of the firm performance analysis. Next slide, please. The concepts of market. Next slide pa. Okay. The concepts of market and demand establishes the relationship between price and demand. Demand as defined is the quantity of a product or service that a buyer is willing to purchase at a given price and time period in a given market, meaning the demand has no significance unless related to both factors, price and unit of time. For example, the statement, the demand for rice is 5 kilogram at 50 pesos means nothing unless we explicitly mention the period for which it is demanded. So instead we say the demand for rice today is 5 kilograms at 50 pesos. Next slide. Note that desire or need becomes a demand only when it is backed by willingness and ability to pay. So shown here are examples of an individual demand schedule and a market demand schedule. An IDS or individual demand schedule shows the various quantities of goods and services at different prices that an individual would purchase, while an MDS or a market demand schedule shows the aggregate quantities that would be purchased by all the consumers in a market at different prices. Next slide, please. The demand curve. The demand curve is a graphical representation of the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded for a given period of time. And because of the inverse relationship between price and demand, the demand curve slopes downward from left to right. We also have here the definition of the derived demand, which is the demand for commodities not consumed directly but needed in the production of other products. Next slide. The law of demand. The law of demand states that quantity purchased varies inversely with price. In other words, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded. It varies inversely, not necessarily proportionately. However, there are exceptions to this, which are the following. First, the Giffen paradox. According to Sir Robert Giffen, even if the prices of necessary goods increase, the demand doesn't. Examples of necessary goods are rice, bread, water, and etc. Second, prestigious goods. Because of the prestige attached to goods like diamond and cars, the law of demand also does not apply and the demand does not decrease with the increase in prices. Third, in a speculative business, when there is a speculation of a future increase in prices of a certain commodity, people buy more of that commodity. Fourth, in periods of trade cycles, wherein during the prosperity period, people tend to buy more regardless of the high prices, while during depression, they buy less even if prices are low. Fifth, ignorance of the consumers. Because these people believe that high priced goods are of good quality, they still may buy even at high prices. Next slide. The demand curve and demand function. The demand function states that, other factors remaining constant, the quantity demanded X for any commodity is a function of its price P per unit. Hence the formula X is a function of P. The demand curve focuses on the price-quantity relationship, holding other factors constant, and usually slopes downward from left to right, which indicates that demand is a decreasing function of price. The demand curve also enables us to determine 1. the maximum quantity of a commodity a consumer will purchase at a particular price and the maximum price for a particular quantity. Next slide. The linear relationship of demand and price. Like the one shown on the left side of the screen, the demand curve is a straight line if the relationship between demand and price is linear. In linear relationships, the direction and rate of change in one variable are constant with respect to changes in the other variable. The linear relation is denoted by the formula x equals alpha minus beta times p, where x is the quantity demanded, alpha and beta are the constants, and p is price. Next slide, please. Okay. Y equals mx plus c is the formula for the slope of the demand curve, and when the slope is negative, the formula becomes y equals c minus mx, where m is the slope of the line, c is the y-intercept, and x and y are the variables. It is stated here that the slope of the demand curve is always negative. Why? It's because the demand curve generally slopes downward from left to right. It has a negative slope because two important variables, price and quantity demand, work in opposite directions. It only becomes positive in rare cases when the demand curve slopes upward from left to right. That's it for my part. Let's move on to the next reporter, Miss Corinne Kala. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jess. I am Corinne Kala and I will be discussing the factors that determine demand. Next slide, please. As seen on the equation displayed on the slide, the quantity demanded by a consumer per unit of time of a commodity X, denoted by the variable dx, mainly depends on a few things. 1. The price of the commodity, or the price of the good or service itself. As the law of demand states, when prices rise, the quantity of demand falls. In other words, the price of the good and its demand have an inverse relationship. Next determinants are the price of its related goods, such as substitutes and complements. Substitute goods are those which can be used in place of each other. When the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded for its substitutes will also increase. On the other hand, complements are goods which are related to each other in such a way that an increase or decrease in demand for one will also lead to an increase or decrease in the demand of another. As for complements, if the price of a good decreases, the demand for its complementary goods will increase. For the next determinant, we have the income of the household or income of the buyers. It follows that when the income of the household increases, so will the quantity of goods demanded. Fifth are the tastes and preferences of the households. As the public's desires and preference for a certain product or service change, so does its quantity demanded. Last but not the least is the amount spent annually on advertisements of the product and sales promotion. When a product or service is advertised and promoted well, the more likely will its demand increase. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we can see the relationship between income and demand. What is income demand? It is the various quantities of good that would be purchased for at a different levels of income by the consumer. Generally, as I've mentioned earlier, when the income of the people increase, the quantity demand will also increase, ceteris paribus. Thus, a direct relationship exists between income and demand. However, there are two scenarios here. In the case of superior goods or goods of superior quality, we can see that the income demand curve is an upward slope which suggests a positive relationship. When the income increases, the demand for superior goods also increases. However, in the case of inferior goods, it is the opposite. When the income increases, the demand for inferior goods decrease, which we can see on the income demand curve sloping downwards. Why is this so? This is because if the people have more income, they tend to purchase products that have superior quality. Next slide, please. Here we have cross demand. This is an economic concept that measures the responsiveness in the quantity demanded of one good when the price for another good changes. In the case of substitutes, the cross elasticity of demand is always positive because when the price for one good increases, the demand for the substitute good also increases. This is because consumers will prefer a less expensive yet substitutable alternative. As we can see on the graph, as the price of the coffee increases, the demand for its substitute, which is tea, also increased, therefore showing a positive relationship. As for complementary goods, when the price of a good increases, an item closely associated to it or is necessary for its consumption decreases because the demand for the main good has also dropped. On the graph, we can see that the price of petrol on the y-axis and demand for a car on the x-axis. As the price of petrol decreased, the demand for cars increased, therefore showing an inverse or negative relationship. And that would be all for my part. Let us now move on to the next report.
Good day, everyone. I'm Bian Teresa Bautista, and I'll be reporting on the next subtopic, which is all about the elasticity of demand. So, under this, we will cover the three types of elasticity of demand, five types of price and income elasticity of demand, the three types of cross elasticity of demand, and the three measurement methods of elasticity of demand. Next slide. So, to begin, let us define elasticity and elasticity of demand. So, elasticity is the measure of the degree to which the quantity demanded of a good changes in response to a change in price, meaning it shows how sensitive demand for a good is compared to the changes in other economic factors. And elasticity of demand explains the relationship between a proportionate change in demand to a proportionate change in price. This formula here is the percentage method in measuring the price elasticity of demand. Other methods will be discussed later on. There are three main types of elasticities of demand. The first one is the price elasticity of demand. Next slide. It is popular that it is generally referred to as simply elasticity of demand. Then we also have the income elasticity and the cross elasticity of demand. Next slide. The first type, which is the price elasticity of demand, explains the proportionate or percentage change in demand to a proportionate or percentage change in price. It has five types: perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic, relatively inelastic, and unitary elastic. Let us discuss these different types. Next slide, please. So when a small change in the price results in a large change in the quantity demanded, it is perfectly elastic. As presented on the screen, the figure shows that the demand curve, labeled as PD, is parallel to the x-axis and is horizontal, extending infinitely. So for example, wheat bread, which is a staple for some households, is sold in the market by a large number of sellers. If a person wants to buy wheat bread, he could choose among different brands for the purchase. So let's say firm A increased the price of wheat bread above market equilibrium. So as a result, the demand for wheat bread for the firm would decrease as to a great extent as the same product is available with other sellers at cheaper prices. Thus, the demand for wheat bread for a firm A is perfectly elastic. Next slide, please. When a change in price of a product does not bring any change in the quantity demanded, the demand is called perfectly inelastic demand. In this case, the elasticity of demand is zero. Graphically, the perfectly inelastic demand curve labeled as DD is represented as a vertical straight line parallel to y-axis. An example of perfectly inelastic demand would be a life-saving drug that people will pay any price to obtain. Even if the price of the drug would increase dramatically, the quantity demanded would remain unchanged. Next slide. When a percentage change in price is less than the percentage change in quantity demanded, the demand is said to be relatively elastic demand. In other words, a change in demand is greater than a change in price. Therefore, in this case, the elasticity of demand is greater than 1. The demand curve of relatively elastic demand is gradually sloping, which is shown in the figure. So for example, if a local ice cream store starts to charge an extra 20 pesos and it loses half its customers, we can conclude that demand is very elastic. Consumers are unwilling to spend more and therefore go elsewhere instead. Next slide. When a percentage change in price is more than the percentage change in demand, the demand is relatively inelastic. In other words, a change in demand is less than a change in price. Therefore, the elasticity of demand is less than 1. As shown in the figure, the demand curve of relatively inelastic demand is rapidly sloping. An example of this is the demand for gasoline or petrol. The demand for gasoline generally is fairly inelastic, especially in the short run. For many, driving is a necessity and their vehicles obviously require gasoline. The substitutes for car travel offer less convenience and control. However, there are still substitutes or alternatives such as riding a bike, walking, and taking the bus or cab. But generally, if the price of petrol goes up, demand proves very inelastic. Next slide. So the last type of price elasticity is the unitary elastic demand. So the unitary elastic demand occurs when a change in price results in an equivalent change in demand. The numerical value for unitary elastic demand is equal to 1. The demand curve for unitary elastic demand is a rectangular hyperbola, which is shown in the figure. Let us take an example. A television manufacturer sells 100 televisions for 2 million. So that works out as 20,000 per unit. It decides to raise its price by 10% to 22,000 pesos. At the same time, demand falls by an equal 10%, meaning it only sells 90 televisions. However, in reality, there are no examples of unitary demand. The reason being is that human demand is nonlinear. That is to say that there is not a direct relationship between price and demand. There are other factors at play, such as quality, income level, and availability of substitute goods. So, although a product may become 10% cheaper, many will still prefer product X because it is their favorite. For example, Coca-Cola may increase its price by 10%. Demand will not necessarily fall by 10% because many consumers will still prefer it to Pepsi and are willing to pay the extra price. Next slide. So the next is the income elasticity. This explains the proportionate change in income and the proportionate change in demand. It describes the sensitivity to changes in consumer income relative to the amount of a good that consumers demand. It has also 5 types: zero, negative, unitary, relatively elastic, and relatively inelastic. Next slide. So the income elasticity of demand for a product can be elastic or inelastic based on its category, whether it is a normal good, inferior good, or luxury good. So the normal good is a good that experiences an increase in its demand due to a rise in consumers' income. So, for example, are the food staples, clothing, and household appliances. So, as discussed earlier by Ms. Kala, inferior good is a good that whose demand declines when an income rises. So examples are goods that are purchased on a budget. And lastly, the luxury goods, or also called as superior goods, these are products with a demand that is directly related to consumer income. So now that we have already distinguished the types of goods under income elasticity of demand, let us discuss each type of income elasticity. So the zero income elasticity refers to the income elasticity of demand whose numerical value is zero. This is because there is no effect of an increase in consumers' income on the demand for products. The change in income fails to bring any change in demand, as in the case of essential goods or necessities. So, for example, necessity goods such as water and medicine are demanded in the same quantity by a high income and a low income individual. Next is the negative income elasticity, which refers to a kind of income elasticity of demand in which the demand for a product decreases with an increase in consumers' income. For example, if the income of a consumer increases, he would prefer to purchase butter instead of margarine. In such a case, the margarine would be inferior to butter for the customer. So another type is the unitary income elasticity that occurs when a proportionate change in income results in an equivalent change in demand. This is the case for normal goods. So for example, if income increases by 50% and demand also rises by 50%, then the demand would be called unitary income elasticity of demand. In such case, the numerical value of income elasticity of demand is equal to 1. We also have the relatively income elasticity, which means the proportionate change in the demand is more than the proportionate change in price. This is the case for luxury goods such as high-end electronics and automobiles. And lastly, relatively income inelasticity means the proportionate change in the demand is less than the proportionate change in the income. Next slide. So proceeding to the last elasticity of demand, which is the cross elasticity, this measures the rate of change in the demand for one commodity due to the change in the price of its substitutes and complementary goods. The formula for cross elasticity of demand is the percentage change in the demand for commodity X divided by the percentage change in the price of Y. Next slide. So presented on the screen are the three types of goods under cross-price elasticity of demand: substitute goods, complementary goods, and unrelated goods. Next slide. So the cross-elasticity of demand has three types. First, when goods are a substitute for each other, then cross-elasticity of demand is positive. So for example, Burger King may increase the price of its products by 20%. In turn, customers would prefer to go to McDonald's as they may offer a cheaper meal. Consequently, McDonald's sees a rise in demand of 10%. This would suggest that there is a positive relationship between the two. In the case of complementary goods, the cross-elasticity of demand is negative. An increase in the price of one commodity leads to a fall in So a complementary good may be something like an iPhone and an iPhone case. In essence, a consumer won't buy an iPhone case without first purchasing an iPhone. So the complementary good is reliant on the other's demand. And the third is the zero cross elasticity of demand. So the goods have no relationship in consumer consumption patterns. Price changes in one product don't affect the quantity consumed by the other product. So for example, we can compare two random products, pencils and toothbrushes. If the price of the toothbrush was to increase by 10%, it would have no impact on the number of pencils sold. Next slide, please. So there are three popular methods for measuring price elasticity. The first one is the percentage method, one of the commonly used approaches of measuring price elasticity of demand, under which price elasticity is measured in terms of rate of percentage change in demand to the percentage change in price. So as mentioned a while ago, the elasticity of demand could be elastic, inelastic, or unitary. Next slide. The second method is the total outlay method, also known as the expenditure method of measuring the price elasticity of demand. So according to this method, the price elasticity of demand can be measured by comparing the total expenditure of a purchaser both before and after the change in price. While comparing the expenditure, we may get one of three outcomes: whether the purchaser's demand for a good is elastic, unitary, or inelastic. So the formula to get the total outlay is the price per unit multiplied by the quantity of a good purchased or demanded. Next slide. So lastly, the diagrammatic method is divided into two: point elasticity and arc elasticity. So the point method is used to measure the price elasticity of demand at any given point in the curve or between 2 points. According to this method, the elasticity of demand will be different at each point of a demand curve. Thus, this method is applied when there is a small change in price and quantity demanded of the commodity. Price elasticity of demand is mathematically expressed as the lower segment of the demand curve divided by the upper segment of the demand curve. It is also expressed as the change in the quantity demanded divided by the change in price multiplied by the price over quantity demanded. Next slide. And the other method is the arc elasticity, which measures elasticity at the midpoint between two selected points. In the figure, K and R are the 2 points on the demand curve. We can measure the elasticity of demand between these 2 points by dividing the change in quantity demanded by the change in price multiplied by the first and second price over the first and second quantity demanded. So to end, I believe it is important for business owners to understand the price elasticity of their products and services in order to set prices appropriately to maximize firm profits and revenues. Since the primary objective of any firm is to earn profit or increase revenue. And that brings us to the end of this subtopic. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon. I am Maria Giselle Barriga, and for this part, we will differentiate consumer surplus and producer surplus. So, consumer surplus is what we are prepared to pay minus what we actually pay. It is one way to determine the total benefit that consumers receive from their goods and services. If a consumer is willing to pay more for an item than the current asking price, they are theoretically receiving an additional benefit by purchasing the item at that price. If the price was their maximum willingness to pay, theoretically they would get less benefit from the purchased product. So, for example, before making a purchase, most consumers decide how much they are willing to spend on an item. Suppose there is a college student that decides to buy a pair of sneakers which is worth not more than $80. So if the price of the sneakers is $100, then the student may decide not to buy them. However, if the price of the sneakers is $60, the student will likely make the purchase. They may also feel like they got a special deal. So in economic terms, they've experienced a surplus of $20. So the difference between the maximum amount that the student was willing to spend, which is $80, and the market price of the $60 is the consumer surplus. The next one is the producer surplus. So it is the difference between the amount that the producer of a good receives and the minimum amount that he or she would be willing to accept for the good. So, for every economic transaction, there may be both producer surplus and consumer surplus. So, the aggregate or combined surplus is referred to as the economic surplus. Next slide, please. Next, we have here the demand forecasting. So, expecting future demand for a product is called demand forecasting. This estimate is made considering various factors like controllable, non-controllable, present, and anticipated market conditions. Demand forecasting is not a speculation, but it gives a reliable information and estimation of future demand. So a firm can maximize profits only when it produces on the basis on the demand for its products. There will be no problem of over and underproduction if the figure of sales forecast or demand forecast are accurate. As it will reduce or have control over the cost, the profits will certainly go up. Hence, the importance of forecasting is more or less depends upon the nature of the business. Next slide, please. Next, we have here the factors involved in demand forecasting. So the first one is the time factor. So for time factor, demand forecasting may be short-term or long-term. A short-term demand may cover a period of 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year, but not exceeding 1 year, and long forecasting covers a period exceeding 5 years. A business should forecast short-term as well as long-term sales or demands for its products to have a clear view of the business activities. Thus, short-term forecast is one which provides information for day-to-day operations within the limits of resources currently available, while long-term forecasting is more concerned with decisions extending or reducing the units of resources. The next one is the level factor. So, demand forecasting can be undertaken at three different levels. We have the macro level, the industry level, and the firm level. For the macro level, it is concerned with business conditions over the whole economy, measured by an approximate index of industrial production, national income, or expenditure. For industrial level, this includes the preparations of sales forecasting by different trade associations. For firm level, it is an important matter from the managerial point of view. Individual firms forecast their sales. The next factor is the general and specific purpose factor. So, general forecast may be useful for the firm, but it also needs commodity forecast and sales area forecast. Another one is the product. So, as far as the new products are concerned, methods and problems for forecasting are quite different from products already established in the market, as sales trends are known better and the competitive nature is well known. Thus, the methods and problems should be studied accordingly. Next slide, please. The nature of the products. So, products are to be classified under consumer goods and producer goods. So, demand for a product will be mainly dependent on nature of the product. Forecasting methods for producer goods and consumer goods will be different accordingly. Another factor is the competition. So, while making forecasting, market situation and the product position in particular market should be analyzed. In every forecast, every product has special factors for its own. If there is competition in the market, situation is complicated up to what extent with uncertainty and unmeasurable risk, error or inaccuracy in the forecast requires consideration. At the same time, sociological factors are not to be left unattended. The last factor involved in demand forecasting is the consumer behavior. So, what people think about the future, their own personal prospects, and about products and brands are vital factors for firm and industry. So, that's all for my report.
Good day, I am Belly Reyes and I'll report on demand forecasting and different methods of demand forecasting. So, demand forecasting is a data analytics technique that analyzes historical sales data and uses algorithms to estimate future sales and project future customer demand. So, forecasting helps to inform the company of how many units are needed to be ordered, hence preventing the company from spending too much on inventory that won't sell. Demand forecasting is also an important step for businesses to make smart decisions about inventory levels based on purchase trend estimates. So, by accounting for supply chain and inventory activity, a business can foresee the number of materials and service levels needed for its future operations. Next slide, please. So there are different methods of forecasting demand. However, the best forecast methodology for a particular task depends on the nature of the forecasting problem. So when making a choice among forecasting methodologies, a number of important factors must be considered. It is always worth considering the distance into the future that one must forecast, the lead time available for making decisions, the level of accuracy required, the quality of data available for analysis, and most importantly, the cost and benefits associated with the forecasting problem. So, demand forecasting is not a speculation on future activities as it is based on a mathematical law of probability, and also, it is not perfect, but it generally gives reliable information and estimation of future demand. So, since demand forecasting only involves assessment of past data to project future demand, it does not give a 100% prediction but only a reliable estimate that could help the management in its decision making. Next slide, please. So, there are two major classifications of demand forecasting methodology. And first, I'd like to say sorry for that typographical error made in this slide on the PPT that was posted in a canvas because the quanti-quali techniques was interchanged. So the two methods is the opinion survey method or the qualitative technique and the statistical method or the quantitative technique. So first, the opinion survey method is based on the subjective assessment and the consumer plays a dominant role where information is based on consumer opinion. So if the business wants to know the expected demand in the future, it has to get the information based on the consumer's opinions, and it is also the most popular in the demand forecasting, and the qualitative forecasting also takes into account the emerging technologies and innovations that may affect the future sales as well as the pricing changes, the product life cycle, the product upgrades, and more. The second classification is the statistical method or the quantitative technique. So it involves looking at the existing data for a particular company like financial reports, sales, revenue figures, and website analytics. So a company can apply this data using statistical modeling and trend analysis to measure its future activity. Next slide, please. So there are three types of opinion survey method. We have the 100% enumerator survey, the Delphi method, and the Salesforce opinion survey. Next slide, please. So first, we have the 100 enumerator survey. So it is the most direct method of forecasting demand in the short run, and it is a forecasting method that solicits inputs from customers regarding future purchasing plans. So wherein the customers will be asked questions like, what are they planning to buy in the forthcoming period, which is usually a year, and survey techniques like this that skillfully uses interviews and mailed questionnaires are an important forecasting tool, especially for short-term projections. So when these are properly carried out, survey research can provide managers with valuable information that would otherwise be unobtainable. And it has some of its limitations. First, it is an observed fact that a complete 100% enumerator survey will not be possible. This is because some of the customers that you've asked may not actually be willing to participate in the survey. Second is a number of biases may creep into the survey. And lastly, it is very expensive when compared to other methods. Next slide, please. A second type is the Delphi method. So it is a method that uses forecasts derived from an independent analysis of expert opinion. So in the Delphi method, members of panel of experts individually receive a series of questions relating to the underlying forecasting problem. So their responses are then analyzed by an independent party who then tries to elicit a consensus opinion by providing feedback to panel members in a manner that prevents direct identification of individual positions. So this method helps to limit the bandwagon problem of the basic panel consensus approach. This Delphi method is a group process, and it aims at achieving consensuses among its members, and these members consist of the panel of experts. Herein, the experts in the field of marketing research and demand forecasting are engaged in analyzing economic conditions, carrying out sample surveys of markets, and conducting opinion polls. Next slide, please. So these are the following steps used in demand forecasting when using the Delphi method. First, the co-coordinator sends out a set of questions in writing to all the experts co-opted on the panel who are requested to write back a brief prediction. Second, written predictions of experts are collated, edited, and summarized together by the co-coordinator. Third, based on the summary, the co-coordinator designs a new set of questions and gives them to the same experts who answers back in writing. Fourth, the co-coordinator repeats the process of collating, editing, and summarizing the responses. And lastly, the steps 3 and 4 are repeated by the co-coordinator to experts with diverse background until the consensus is reached. So in this if in a case where there is a divergence of opinions and conclusions, the co-coordinator has to sort it out through mutual discussions, and this co-coordinator has to have the necessary experience and background as he plays a key role in designing the structured questionnaires and as well as synthesizing the data, and the direct interaction among experts is avoided nor their identity is disclosed so as to avoid the strong-willed experts from dominating the group. Next slide, please. Lastly, we have a Salesforce opinion survey. So it is a forecasting technique based on salesperson's estimates of expected sales, wherein the sales salesman is expected to estimate sales in the respective territories and zones. So the rationale of this method is that the salesman, being the closest to the customers, are likely to have the most intimate feel in the market. This method is also based on historical data and consumers' opinion. And this method is also known as the collective opinion method, as it takes advantage of the collective wisdom of salesmen, managerial economists, marketing manager, and personnel relating to sales department. So hence it involves the estimates provided by the team of experts under the sales and the marketing department of the company. So in conclusion, the opinion survey method or the qualitative approach are purely based on data collected from the consumer's opinion, which are always volatile. So decisions made with the help of the opinion survey method may not actually be useful or successful in the future. Hence, statistical analysis should be considered for expecting future demand because past experience may actually represent future performance. So next slide, please. So these are the different methods under the statistical method or the quantitative technique. So we have the simple average method, the moving average method, the weighted moving average method, the time series, the linear trend method, the regression analysis, the simultaneous equation method, and the barometric method. First, next slide, please. So first, we have the simple average method. So in this case, we take a simple average of all the past periods. So simple monthly average of all consumption figures collected every month for the last 12 months, or simple quarterly average of the consumption figures collected for the several quarters in the immediate past. So in this case, all the data collected from all figures will be added and then divided by the specified period. Hence, we have the formula simple average is equals to the sum of demands of all periods divided by the number of periods. Next slide, please. Next, we have the moving average method. So it is a forecasting method that uses an average of the n most recent periods of data to forecast the next period. So this method takes a fixed number of periods, and after the elapse of each period, data for the oldest period is discarded and the most recent past period is included. So in this method, the company would choose or specify a certain range of period to be used, and the sum of the demands of the chosen period will be averaged by the time period chosen. So whatever the period selected, it must be kept constant once it is already decided. Hence, we have the formula. The moving average is equals to the sum of demands of chosen periods divided by the number of chosen periods. Next slide, please. So we'll have this example. Donna's Garden Supply wants a 3-month moving average forecast for shed sales. So the first column shows the months from January to December. The second column shows the actual demand for the product, and the last column shows the forecasted demand for the product on its corresponding month. So since this example uses a 3-month period, we started out with April. So this needs the demand for the past 3 months. Hence, we will use the data from January to March. So in this case, we will add all the demands for the past 3 months. So 10 plus 12 plus 13, and the summation will be divided by 3. So for April, we have forecasted an 11 and 2/3 demand. And for the next month, which is the month of May, we now have to discard the January data and use the February to April since it is its most recent 3-month demand. So the same thing, we will add all the 3 demands and divide the value by 3. Hence, our forecasted demand for May is 13 and 2/3. So this process will then repeat until December. Next slide, please. Next method is the moving average method. So this allows varying weights for demands in all periods. So in the moving average method earlier, the weights given to the selected number of periods are the same. And this issue has been refined in the weighted moving average method by using different weights based on the level of significance. So this method has the advantage that it allows the forecaster to compensate for some known trend in demand or seasonality of demand by carefully fitting appropriate coefficient of weights to that period. So in this case, the most recent period is given more significance in forecasting the demand for the next period compared to the least recent data. Hence, we have the formula weighted moving average is equals to the summation of the weight 1 multiplied to demand 1 plus the weight 2 multiplied by the demand 2 until weight sub n, demand sub n, and the total will be divided by its total weights. Next slide, please. So using the same example we had earlier, so instead of just directly adding all three demands for the past period, we now give more significance on the most recent one by allotting higher weight. So in the moving average, our divisor was 3 because all the three demands have the same weight, which is 1. But in the moving average method, the total weights would now be 6. So that is the summation of all the weights, 3 plus 2 plus 1, hence equals to 6. So in this method, the process of forecasting is just the same with the moving average method. It's just that we gave different weights on based on their level of significance. So for the April forecast, we multiply the January demand by 1, and then the February demand by 2, and lastly the March demand by 3. And the sum of these demands will be divided by the total weight of 6, hence giving us a 2 and 1/6 forecasted demand for the month of April. Next slide, please. Next method is the time series. So, trend analysis or time series relating to sales represent the past pattern of effective demand for a particular product. The most popular It is the most popular method of analysis of time series is to project the trend of the time series. So this method is very simple and inexpensive. So time series model predict on the assumption that the future is actually a function of the past. So in other words, they look at what happened over a period of time and uses a series of data to make that forecast. And the basic assumption of this method is that the trend will also persist in the future. Next slide, please. Next method is we have the linear trend. So a time series forecasting method that fits a trend line to a series of historical data points and then projects the line into the future for forecast. So this uses the least squares method. So the least squares method is a statistical procedure to find the best fit for a set of data points. So the least squares regression is used to predict the behavior of the dependent variable. So this approach results in a straight line that minimizes the sum of the least squares of the vertical differences or deviations from the line to each of the actual observations. So the least squares line is described in the terms of its y-intercept and its expected change, which is the slope. Hence, we have the equation y is equals to a plus bx. The linear trend is also appropriate when the time series reveal a rising trend in sales, or in other words, there is a direct relationship between the sales and time. So mathematically, again, we have the formula y is equals to a plus bx, where y is our dependent variable. So in this case, we have our annual sales. The a is our constant or the intercept value on the graph. The b is the slope or the constant rate of increase. The x is our independent variable, which is the time or the number of years. So by applying the least squares method on that equation, we cannot get the value of a and b. So we have the another formula, summation of y is equals to na plus b summation of x, or the summation of xy is equals to a summation of a x plus b summation of x squared. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a linear trend where on the x-axis is our time period, and the y-axis we have the value of the dependent variable, and the line or the trend line is defined by the formula y is equals to a plus bx, and the asterisk is actually the actual observation or the actual y value, and the difference between the actual observation and the point on a trend line shows the deviation or for our forecasting error. Next slide, please. Next method, we have the regression analysis. So regression equation establishes the relationship between dependent variable and independent variable, assuming the relationship to be linear. So for some commodities, independent variable is only one. Hence, we have the simple regression equation, which is just the same with the linear trend method we had earlier. So we have the formula y is equals to a plus bx, wherein the independent variable is the x and the dependent variable is the y. But for some products, independent variables may be more than two, and in such case, multiple regression analysis can be used. Hence, we have the formula y is equals to a plus b sub 1 times x sub 1 plus b sub 2 times x sub 2 plus until b sub n times x sub n. And in this case, we have more than two independent variables. So our independent variables are denoted by x sub 1, x sub 2 until x sub n, and our dependent variable is y. Next slide, please. So these are the limitations in using the regression analysis method. First, it is difficult to find out interdependence relationship between the variables. So the relationship between the variables might be difficult or cannot be established, hence the linear projection would be unavailable. Second, sometimes it may be difficult to identify the dependent or and independent variables. Third, indicators are based on historical data, but the relationship cannot be established for the future. So in this case, the relationship between the variables shown in the past might not be true in the current or in the future period. Next slide, please. Next method, we have the simultaneous equation. So by establishing relation between two variables with the help of equation, we can estimate demand for a product. So these equations are mathematical linear equations in order to arrive there. So for example, we have 4a plus 3b is equals to 15 and 3a plus 4b is equals to 20. So by solving these equations, we can find the values of a and b, and using elimination and substitution method by using the elimination and substitution method in algebra. So these simultaneous equations uses two or more algebraic equations that shares variables. So in our example, we have the variables a and b, and when we have at least as many equations as our variables, we may be able to solve them. So in this method, it is necessary to establish the relationship between the two variables used so as to determine the right estimate of our forecasted demand. And we also have this method also has its limitations. First, it is difficult to find out an appropriate equation and relationship between variables. Second, for new products, it is not suitable as no past data is available. So in this case, the simultaneous equation method is not suitable because in order to establish the relationship between the variables, past data regarding the movement of these variables must be available. Third, a few indicators always correctly indicate changes in another variable. So this shows that only some of the variables could correctly indicate changes in another variables. However, some other variables considered could not, and hence the relationship between these variables cannot be established. Next slide, please. So the last method under the quantitative method is the barometric method. So in this method, estimations of future demand will be made based on index numbers. So economic indicators like the whole price index or the consumer price index. So this method is also known as the leading indicators forecasting, and the researchers should try to understand and establish relationship between products and indices. So as an economic leading indicator, this method can help to predict and forecast future events and trends in businesses, markets, and the economy. And for its limitations, first, it is difficult to find out an appropriate indicator. Second, for new products, it is not suitable as no past data are available. Third, a few indicators always correctly indicate changes in another variable. And lastly, indicators are based on historical data, but their relationship cannot be established in the future. So that would be all for the methods of demand forecasting.
Good day, I am Kathleen Tito and I will be reporting price determination under perfect competition. So before discussing price determination under perfect competition, let us first recall what a market is, as well as its structures. This topic was already covered in the past semester under our economic subject. So to start, a market consists of firms and individuals willing and able to buy or sell a given product. This includes firms and individuals currently engaged in buying and selling a particular product, as well as potential entrants, which is known as either an individual or firm posing a sufficiently credible threat of market entry to affect the price or output decisions of incumbent firms. They play extremely important roles in many industries. Some are those with only a few active participants, who might at first appear to hold the potential for substantial economic profits. However, a number of potential entrants can have a substantial effect on the price or output decisions of incumbent firms. So market structure, on the other hand, is a competitive environment in the market for any good or service, and this is typically characterized on the basis of four significant industry characteristics, namely the number of size distribution of active buyers and sellers and potential entrants, the degree of product differentiation, the amount and cost of information about product price and quality, and conditions of entry and exit. Markets, as shown in the diagram, are typically divided into two main categories: the perfect and imperfect competition, in which monopolistic competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and duopoly belongs. So this part that I will be discussing will only focus on perfect competition, specifically in price determination. So first, what is perfect competition? Perfect competition is a basic feature of a competitive market or a market where there are numerous producers that compete with one another in hopes to provide goods and services we, as consumers, want and need. Perfect competition is a market structure characterized by a large number of buyers and sellers of essentially the same product. Hence, competition is said to be perfect when producers offer what buyers want at prices just sufficient to cover the marginal cost of output. In addition, perfect competition exists when individual producers have no influence on market prices. They are price takers as opposed to price makers, and this lack of influence on prices typically require the following characteristics or features. First, large number of buyers and sellers. When there is a large number of buyers and sellers, this means that each firm produces a small portion of industry output and each customer buys only a small part of the total. Second, homogeneous or identical goods, or product homogeneity. This feature means that the output of each firm is essentially the same as the output of any other firm in the industry. Third, free entry and exit. This obviously means that firms are not restricted from entering nor leaving the industry. So new firms can enter the market or old firms can exit without any barriers. Fourth, knowledge of buyers and sellers to prices or the perfect dissemination of information. This means that the cost, price, and product quality information are known by all buyers and all sellers. The fifth feature is that factors must be mobilized from those places where they are getting less remuneration to those places where they will get maximum remuneration. So, since all consumers have perfect information about competing prices, from the fourth on the list of the features, all goods must sell at a single price. Seventh, exclusion of transport cost in the price level. This is because under perfect competition, prices must be maintained at a uniform level. And the last feature is the difference between the firm and the industry. Under perfect competition, there is a difference between the two. The firm is a production unit, while the industry is a group of production units, or in short, a group of firms. So moving on, we now go to price determination. Before defining what price determination is, what first is a price and what does it convey? So price is that which you, a consumer, have to give up in order to receive a product or service. In this subject, price is referred to as the money someone charges for a good or service. Now, what is price determination? So the demand and supply forces in general determine the price. And under perfect competition, the price is set at a point when demand and supply are equal, which will be illustrated in the next slide. So here is a diagram that illustrates price determination under a perfectly competitive market. This diagram is not new to our eyes as we already encountered this in our past subjects. So supply and demand is an economic model of price determination in a market. It includes It concludes rather that in a competitive market, the unit price for a particular good will vary until it settles at a point where the quantity demanded by consumers will equal the quantity supplied by producers, resulting in an economic equilibrium of price and output or quantity. As can be seen in the diagram, the supply represented by S and demand represented by D meet at the equilibrium represented by the intersection of the demand and supply curves, or E. So in a perfectly competitive market, there are different situations of price determination. One is when demand changes and supply remains constant. Another is when the demand remains constant and supply changes, and when both the demand and supply are changed. Separate diagrams of these three will be presented in the next slides. So, this diagram illustrates the effect of changes in the demand to the equilibrium price and output or quantity while supply remains unchanged. The equilibrium price of a product represented by E is determined by a balance between production at each price, or the supply represented by S, and the desires of those with purchasing power at each price, or the demand represented by D. The diagram shows a constant upward sloping supply curve as well as both a positive and negative shift in demand curve D. The positive shift is the one going up from D to D1, or from E to E1, which resulted in an increase in the price from P to P1, as well as an increase in output from M to M1. Whereas the negative shift is the one that goes down from D to D2, or from E to E2, resulting in a decrease in price from P to P2 and output or quantity from M to M2. To conclude, the diagram shows that there is a positive relationship between the demand and price, as well as a positive relationship between price and quantity or output. In short, this diagram just illustrates the law of supply. Moving on, this diagram illustrates the effect of changes in the supply to the equilibrium price and output or quantity while demand remains unchanged. Again, the equilibrium price of a product represented by E is determined by a balance between production at each price, or the supply, and the desires of those with purchasing power at each price, or the demand. So the diagram shows a constant downward sloping demand curve as well as both a positive and negative shift in supply curve S. The positive shift is the one going to the right from S to S1, which results in an intersection that yields lower prices from P to P2 and an increase in output from M to M1. Whereas the negative shift is the one that goes to the left, or from S to S2, causing prices to rise from P to P1 and a decrease in output or quantity from M to M2, as illustrated in the diagram. The diagram therefore shows a negative relationship between supply and price, as well as a negative relationship between price and quantity or output, or in short, this diagram illustrates the law of demand. Finally, we are now in the last situation when both the demand and supply are changed, which is illustrated in this diagram. With this, again, the equilibrium price of a product is determined by a balance between the supply and the demand. We can see in the diagram that there is only one price that is constant and is not changing. For instance, both the supply and demand have increased from D to D1 and S to S1 respectively. The price from E to E1 still remains at P, but it can be observed that the quantity of output increases from M to M1 as shown in the diagram. In the same way, when both the demand and supply decreases from D to D2 and from S to S2, the price still remains unchanged, but the output decreases from M to M2. The diagram just shows that under perfect competition, if both the demand and supply are changing in the same direction and at the same rate, then the price may not change. So that ends my part of the report. The next reporters will be discussing the price determination as well as output determination and price discrimination under imperfect competition, specifically under monopolistic competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and duopoly.
Thank you, Ms. Tito. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cristal Per Autantico, and on this part of the presentation, the topic will be the price determination under monopoly, oligopoly, and duopoly. And I will be discussing to you the first one, which is the price determination under monopoly. But before that, let us discuss monopoly. Next slide, please. So, what is monopoly? In the word monopoly, mono means single and poly means seller. If combined together, it means single seller. So monopoly is a situation in which only one seller in the market is producing a product or commodity and that there are no close substitutes on that product. But the true power of monopoly comes from its ability to keep competitors out of the market. However, companies don't need to have a literal monopoly to actually exercise monopoly power. When a single company has a huge market share in its industry, for example, Google, they wield a lot of power that pure monopoly would. And to further explain, let us determine each of the features of monopoly. Next slide, please. So first is the same thing as what I said earlier, that in monopoly, there is only one seller. Next is that there is no close substitutes. In a monopoly, there are no other companies who produce similar products or even nearer commodities. Third, there is no difference between firm and industry. In monopoly, there is only a single firm who creates a certain product, and again, no other companies produce similar products, which is why it is just similar to an industry. So there is a single seller in a certain industry and a single seller on the other. Fourth, there is no entry under there is no free entry under monopoly. This is actually the true power of monopoly since it allows firms to keep competitors out of the market. And fifth, monopolists control only the price or output. They have substantial control over the price of a product, which is why they can earn abnormal profits compared to a market with a perfect competition. Monopolists can also control the amount of output available in the market, but they cannot control both at the same time. And lastly, under monopoly, the revenue curve falls down from left to right, and I will be expanding on this on the next slide. So, how do we actually determine the price and output of a commodity under a monopolistic market? So, here are 5 important conditions to remember in order to determine the price and output. So, first, marginal cost must be equal to the marginal revenue. Then, an increase in supply will make the AR and MR fall down from left to right. An increase in output requires a reduction of price level. Third, AR is equal to the price. Fourth, MR falls more rapidly than AR. And lastly, AR is more than the MR and AC. The difference between AR and AC is the abnormal profits. So let's explain more of this through the figure on the right. In here, the x-axis represents the output and the y-axis represents the price. The AR is the average revenue and MR is the marginal revenue. When the monopolists decide to increase the output of their products, the AR and MR curves will fall down from left to right. Now, why is it that the MR falls more rapidly than AR? So MR falls more rapidly because when the monopoly firm reduces price, it does not just reduce it on that incremental unit. Rather, it would have to reduce its price on all of the units. Next, how do we determine the quantity of output for a company to produce? So in terms of quantity, we have to look at the MC, which is the marginal cost curve. The MC curve on the diagram is upward sloping, and based on the first condition, the output is determined when MC equals MR. And in the diagram, they are both equal at point E. So that's how we determine the output. We just have to look at the area where MC intersects with the MR, and that becomes the optimal output for a monopoly firm to maximize profit. Next, what is the price of a product based on this diagram? So the price is The P, which is that one on the y-axis, it's just above point E, but here we look at the AR. Also, we could see at point Q that the price is greater than the MC, and it supports the idea that at a higher quantity, people are willing to pay more than the marginal cost, which is a benefit on the part of the seller. The profit is determined by deducting the ORSM by OPQM. So it is the one that is the rectangular shape on the diagram. An important note to take on this part is that only when the MC equals MR can a company earn maximum profits. If it goes beyond or below that, then the profit will decrease. So again, monopolies produce at the point where MR equals MC, but charge the price expressed on the AR curve for that quantity of production. Next slide, please. Now, on this slide, we will determine the price when costs are increasing, constant, and diminishing. This is one of the differences between monopoly and perfect competition, because in perfect competition, the cost curves at equilibrium are at an increasing stage, while in monopoly, the cost curves may increase, may be constant, or decrease at equilibrium level. So here in diagram A, the cost is increasing. If we look at point E, which is where the MC equals MR, it is already above the average total cost, which is the point R. And in diagram B, the price here is constant. The MC is constant and is parallel to the x-axis. The MR and MC are equal at point R, and the total profit here is the PQRS. And in diagram C, the price is diminishing or decreasing. The point E is much lower compared to the first diagram that we have seen earlier. So next slide, please. Now, in monopoly, firms can also engage in a practice called price discrimination. Price discrimination is the practice of charging customers different prices for exactly the same product or commodity. In here, monopolists sell products at different prices to different buyers. But why do monopolists practice price discrimination? The reason is that monopolists want to earn the most revenue possible from each customer. So in short, this is their way to increase revenue. And we have here the kinds of price discrimination and the conditions on how price discrimination is made possible. The different kinds of price discrimination are personal, place, and trade discrimination. In personal discrimination, sellers charge customers based on their ability to pay. For example, a seller may charge more from a rich customer and lesser charge from a poor customer for the same kind of product bought. In place or local discrimination, there is a different charge for a different places. Basically, a seller may sell a higher price in one place and a lower price in another. Example, electricity companies sell electricity at a cheaper rate in rural areas and higher rate in urban areas. And in trade or use discrimination, monopolists charge different prices based on how the same commodity is used. So for example, electricity used for agricultural purposes would be charged lower than for those who use electricity for industrial purposes. And there are certain conditions to be satisfied in order to make price discrimination possible. First is that there must be more than one market. So without this, sellers won't be able to charge different prices to different buyers. A business needs to be able to segregate the market based on the consumer's willingness to pay. For example, airline industry. So the airline industry uses price discrimination using time. They charge less for those that book early than those that book late. So a student might only be able to pay less than 1,000 pesos if he or she books a seat weeks or months in advance. And a businesswoman who needs to be at a meeting tomorrow might be willing to pay more for the same type of seat that the student booked on the same flight. Second condition, there should be different elasticity of demand. The seller must be able to identify which consumers have elastic demand and which have inelastic demand. In order to get maximum profits, the monopolists should charge more on those products in which there is inelastic demand and less price in the case of those products in which the demand is elastic. Because if the elasticity of demand is equal in all markets, then there will be no scope for price discrimination. Next slide, please. So again, the main reason why monopolists practice price discrimination is to get maximum profits. And the conditions needed to arrive at such profit are the following. First, the monopolists must fix more prices in the case of inelastic demand and lower prices in the case of elastic demand. And second, all the marginal revenues in different markets must be equal to marginal cost. Next slide, please. So now that we have grasped the idea of monopoly, we can now differentiate it with the perfect competition, which was discussed by Ms. Tito. So in perfect competition, there is a large number of buyers and sellers. Sellers produce similar products, and the activity of a single seller or buyer may not influence the entire market price. Whereas in monopoly, there is only a single seller of a commodity, which means there is no competition. Second, revenue curves are parallel to the x-axis, so it is moving on a horizontal pattern, while revenue curves in monopoly are downward sloping. Third, the AR and MR are equal and are parallel to the x-axis, while in monopoly, both MR and AR fall down from left to right. So that is actually um, AR, guys, not AC. So fourth, in order to determine the price under perfect competition, the supply must be equal to the demand. Whereas under monopoly, price is determined when MC equals MR. It bases its price on both because it is at that point where the monopolist's firm can obtain maximum profits. Fifth, under perfect competition, there is free entry and exit. Companies may enter especially when the industry that they are into are obtaining maximum profits and may exit when it is receiving low profits. However, in monopoly, there is no freedom to enter the market. This is basically an essential power that firms have. They have the ability to keep competitors out of the market. Sixth, the concept of firm and industry under perfect competition is actually different, whereas under monopoly, it is the same. Seventh, under perfect competition, companies may earn abnormal profits in the short run and normal profits in the long run because of low barriers to entry. In monopoly, firms may get abnormal profits in the short run and may get normal profits in the long run because of high barriers to entry. This means that under monopoly, firms normally obtain abnormal profits through the years of operation. Eighth, another difference is that under perfect competition, AC becomes minimum at equilibrium point, while the AC curve under monopoly is falling at equilibrium point. And second to the last, companies produce more output when price is less, while in monopoly, output is less and price is more. So we have to remember here that monopolist firms are price makers, so they can decide how a commodity can be worth. And lastly, there is no price discrimination under perfect competition. Companies are price takers, which means that they can only take the market price as given, while in monopoly, there is possible price discrimination. So that would be all for my part on the price determination under monopoly. The continuation will be discussed by Ms. Fritzy Orongan. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Cristal. So, good day, everyone. I am Fritzen Rangan, and I am going to talk about monopolistic competition and price determination under oligopoly and duopoly. So, what is a monopolistic competition? So, it is found in the industry where there is a large number of small sellers selling differentiated but close substitute products. Examples are hotels, restaurants, coffee shops, and salons. It is also the midway of perfect competition and monopoly since there are some elements of perfect competition and monopoly in monopolistic competition. Next slide, please. So what are the features of monopolistic competition? First, existence of large number of firms. So there are large number of firms in the market and the output of each firm is very much lesser in the total output. Because of this, each firm acts independently and the decisions of any one firm do not directly affect those of its competitors. Number two, product differentiation. So the products are not homogeneous and the products are close substitutes. They have distinct features such as branding or quality. So the firms in monopolistic competition typically try to differentiate their products in order to achieve above market returns because the products served have the same purpose. Number three, free entry and exit. So the firms can freely enter and exit the market. Fourth is excess capacity. Firms under monopolistic competition operates with excess capacity. The firm's profit maximizing output is less than the output associated with minimum average cost. All firms, regardless of the type of market it operates in, will produce to a point where demand or price equals average cost. In a perfectly competitive market, this occurs where the perfectly elastic demand curve equals minimum average cost. In a monopolistic competitive market, the demand curve is downward sloping. So in the long run, this leads to excess capacity. And lastly, selling costs. The firms in monopolistic competition are price setters or makers rather than price takers. In order to actually raise their prices, the firms must be able to differentiate their products from their competitors. Also, firms spend large amounts on advertising and other forms of marketing. The costs on advertisements are commonly called selling costs. According to Chamberlain, selling cost is that cost which shifts the demand curve towards right side. Therefore, the selling costs are useful for the increase of demand. And through advertising and propaganda, the firm will popularize the quality of the products. Next slide, please. So these are diagrams of short-run equilibrium under monopolistic competition. So the first diagram is about short-run equilibrium under abnormal profits. So we can see at the diagram the SAR, or the short-run average revenue curve, and is also the demand line. SMR is the short-run marginal revenue curve, SAC is the short-run average cost curve, and SMC is the short-run marginal cost curve. SMR and SMC are equal at point E. Therefore, the equilibrium level of output is OM and the price is OP. The OPQM is the total revenue and OSR is the total cost. Therefore, QR is the amount of abnormal profit per one unit. The PQRS is the total amount of profit. In short period, it is possible that some firms may get abnormal profits, like same in the diagram, and some firms may get normal profits or losses. The second diagram shows the short-run equilibrium under normal profit. So the firm is getting only normal profits which are included in the cost of production. The equilibrium output is OM, and at OM output level, the price is OP, which is also equal to average cost. The OPQM is the total revenue and total cost. So the firm is getting only normal profits. And the last diagram, so the firm is getting losses. At OM output level, the price is OP, but the unit cost that is the average cost is OS. Therefore, the firm is getting PS or QR amount of loss. OPQM is the total revenue and OSRM is the total cost. So the PQRS is the total amount of loss. Next slide, please. So this is the diagram of long-run equilibrium under monopolistic competition. So under monopolistic competition, there is a free entry and exit. So if the existing firms are getting profits, then some firms may enter the market, and if the firms are getting losses, then the firms have the freedom to leave the market. So therefore, in the long run, the firms only getting normal profits. In this diagram, LAC is the long-run average cost curve, LMC is the long-run marginal revenue curve, and LAR is the long-run average revenue curve. The LMC and LMR are equal at point E. The output is determined as OM and the price is OP. In the diagram, average cost is equal to average revenue. So the firm is getting only normal profits in the long run. So these normal profits are included in the cost of production. Next slide, please. So perfect competition versus monopolistic competition. So the firms in perfect competition demonstrates a perfectly elastic demand schedule, whereas in monopolistic competition, the firms produce differentiated products and compete mainly on non-price competition. So the demand curves in individual companies for monopolistic competition are downward sloping. Next, the firm gets an equilibrium position at that level that the AC is minimum, while in monopolistic competition, the firm gets an equilibrium position at point Q where the LAC curve is at a falling stage. And lastly, there is no markup in a perfect competition structure because the price is equal to marginal cost. However, in monopolistic competition, comes with a product markup. So as the price is always greater than the marginal cost. Markup is the difference between price and marginal cost. Next slide, please. So price determination under oligopoly. So what is oligopoly? So the term oligopoly is derived from the two Greek words. Oligos means a few and polling means to sell. So therefore, oligopoly refers to that form of imperfect competition where there will be few sellers that are producing either homogeneous products or products which are close substitutes. It is also referred as competition among the few. For example, auto industry, cable television, commercial air travel, telecommunications, and internet service providers. Next slide, please. So what are its features? First, interdependence. In oligopoly market, there is an element of interdependence of the firms. The price and output decisions of one firm will affect the other firms. For instance, if one firm reduces its price, all the others will follow in order to maintain their position in the market. Number two, indeterminate demand curve. No firm in oligopoly can forecast with fair degree of certainty about the nature and position of its demand curve. The demand curve is unknown due to different behavior patterns of organizations. Every organization keeps an eye on the actions of rivals and makes strategies accordingly. Therefore, the demand curve under oligopoly is never stable and shifts in response to the actions of rivals. 3. Element of monopoly. In oligopoly market where there are only few firms, monopoly element may be prevailed in the market. Each firm controls a large share of market. Also, there exist some elements of monopoly under oligopolistic situation. Fourth, importance of selling costs. The firms under oligopolistic market employ aggressive and defensive weapons to gain a greater share in the market and to maximize sale. In view of this, firms have to incur a great deal on advertisement and other measures of sale promotion. Thus, advertising and selling costs play a great role in the oligopolistic market structure. And lastly, price rigidity. The price will be kept unchanged due to the fear of realization that the price will tend to be inflexible. The reasons for price rigidity are: first, the firm knows the ultimate outcome of price change. Second, the revised prices further lead to irritation among the consumers. And lastly, to discourage any new firm entering in the field of production. Next slide, please. Price determination under oligopoly can be determined in three ways. So first is independent pricing. In order to maximize profits, the firms in oligopoly market may resort to independent price policy. Every firm may estimate the reaction and calculation of its rivals and then fix its own price and output. Each firm keeps a close eye on the activities of the other firms in the industry. Since oligopolistic firms engage in competition among the few, decisions made by one firm consistently affects others. Next is pricing under collusion. The firms may make cartel arrangements. What is a cartel? So it is an association of independent firms within the same industry, and it follows common policies relating to price, output, sales, and profit maximization. So cartels may be voluntarily or compulsory be open or secret depending upon the policy of the government. So the centralized cartel determines the output produced by different firms, and the price is also determined which is the most acceptable by all firms. Last is the price leadership. It is a situation in which one firm assumes the role of a price leader and fixes the price of the product for the entire industry. The other firms in the industry simply follow the price leader and accept the price fixed by him and adjust their output to this price. The price leader is generally a very large or dominant firm or a firm with the lowest cost of production. It often happens that price leadership is established as a result of price war in which one firm emerges as the winner. So in oligopolistic market situation, it is very rare that prices are set independently, and there is usually some understanding among the oligopolists operating in the industry. Next slide, please. So the price and output determination under oligopoly can be explained with the help of this diagram. So the popular method with regards to the price and output determination is the method of kink demand curve. In this diagram, the x-axis is the output, and on the y-axis, costs, revenue, and price are determined. So the demand curve DD1 has a kink at point K, and it is the average revenue curve. The point K divides the demand curve into two parts. The DK part of demand curve is the elastic one, while the KD part of the demand curve is the less elastic. So there is a price rigidity in oligopoly market. The marginal cost becomes equal to marginal revenue at point E. Therefore, the output is determined as OM and the price is OP. Next slide, please. Price determination under duopoly. So let us first define what is duopoly. So duopoly means two sellers. It is a two competing businesses controlling the majority of the market sector for a particular product or the service they provide. So duopoly is the most basic form of oligopoly, a market dominated by a small number of companies. Next slide, please. So there are three types of duopoly model. So the first is the Carnot solution. So Carnot is a French economist and found a solution to duopoly pricing in 1838. So his model describes an industry structure in which rival companies offering an identical product compete on the amount of output they produce independently at the same time. So the Carnot model is applicable when companies produce identical or homogeneous products. So it assumes they cannot collude or form a cartel and have the same view of market demand and are familiar with the competitor's operating costs. So his model is based on the following assumptions. So first, the total output must be sold. The two sellers produce and sell a homogeneous product. The number of buyers is large. Each seller knows the demand curve for his product. Fifth, the cost of production is assumed to be zero. Each rival's plans of output. Seventh, each supplier takes the supply of his rival to be constant. Eighth, each accepts the market demand for his product. And lastly, each seller aims at maximum revenue. Carnot assumed that there are two firms, for example, Carnot assumed that there are two firms, each owning a mineral well, and it operates with zero cost. So they sell output in a market with a straight line demand curve. So each firm acts on the assumption that its competition will not change its output. So it decides its own so as to maximize its profits. Next slide, please. Next is the Edgeworth model. So this model is based on the assumption of same as core notes, except that each seller takes his rival's supply constant. Edgeworth assumes that each seller takes the price of his rival instead of output to remain constant. So the price continually varies between competitive and monopolistic levels. According to him, the duopoly situation is indeterminate and unstable equilibrium. Next slide, please. Next is the Chamberlain's model. Chamberlain's contribution to the theory of oligopoly consists that his suggestion that a stable equilibrium can be reached with monopoly price being changed by all firms. If firms recognize their interdependence and act so as to maximize the industry profit. So his model is based on the assumption of homogeneous products, firms of equal size with identical costs, no entry by new firms, and full knowledge of demand. So the diagram below is the Chamberlain model. So in this figure, DQ is the market demand curve. If firm, if firm A is first to enter the market, it will produce output OQ1, which is presented in the diagram. And because at this level of output, its marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. So the firm can charge price OP1, which is the monopoly price. So this will maximize its profits. The firm B entering the market at that stage considers that its demand curve is CQ and thus will produce Q1, Q2 so as to maximize its profit. So it will charge price OP2. It now realizes that it cannot sell QQ1 quantity at the monopoly price and thus decides to reduce the output to QQ3, which is one half of the monopoly output QQ1. Then firm B can continue to produce quantity Q1, Q2, which is the same as Q3, Q1. The industry output is OQ1 and the price rises to the level OP1. This is an ideal situation from the point of view of both firms A and B. In this case, the joint output of the two firms is monopoly output and they charge monopoly price. Thus, considering the assumption of equal costs, the market will be shared equally between firms A and B. Thus, in Chamberlain's model, the sellers are independent, yet they are in kind of collusion, which leads to stable equilibrium, a sort of monopoly equilibrium, and it demonstrates that in the market, the number of firms can be irrelevant and the perfectly competitive results can be reached. That is all for my part. Thank you.
So good day, I'm Benedict Dukta and I'm going to discuss about the market factors affecting pricing decisions. Next slide, please. So in total, there are 9 factors influencing the price of a product. So first is the target customers. It's already a given that if your target customers demand is high, so I'm sorry, when your target customers demand is low, it has an inverse relationship with your price. So as the price goes up, the demand will also go down. Next is the cost of the product. So the cost of the product, this includes the production and the distribution cost in producing and marketing your product. So if your cost of the product is high, this will also result in a higher price. Now, next is the competition. So um, severe competition may indicate a lower price for the product because uh, there are many competitors in market and the customers will always choose the business or the product with a lower price. So the fourth one is the law. So we cannot uh we cannot control what the government states or what the government um uh I'm sorry, what the government would say in relation to the prices of the product. So there are numerous restrictions on the pricing activities, and one of the examples is the SRP, or the suggested retail price, um, employed by the government. So next is social responsibility. This may affect many parties, which includes the employees, shareholders, and the public at large. So next is the market position of the firm. When we say market position, it is the consumer's perception of a brand or product in relation to the competing brands of the product, oh, um, brands or products rather. So if the market position is high, so this will also affect the price of the product. The seventh is the distribution channel policy. So as the channel or the distribution channel is longer, this will be this will add to the distribution cost of the product, thus making the price of the product higher. So the eighth one is the price elasticity of the product. So as I mentioned a while ago, the price and the demand of the product has an inverse relationship. So as the price goes up, the demand will um, the demand will decrease. But if the price falls, the demand will increase. So the last factor is the economic condition. So in recessions, prices are reduced to a sizable extent, while in a higher boom period of economic environment, this will increase the cost of production and distribution, thus increasing the price of the product. So next slide, please. So there are different types of method of pricing, which are um, broadly classified into four. So I'm going to discuss the first three. So the first is the competition-oriented pricing. The second is the demand-oriented pricing, and the third is pricing based on other economic considerations. Next slide, please. So for the competition-oriented pricing, there are five types of pricing. The first one is going rate pricing. So in this pricing, a firm sets its price according to the general pricing structure in the industry, or according to the price set by the price leader. When we say price leader, it is the leading firm, which is able to exert enough influence in the market that it can significantly determine the price of that product. So, going rate meaning average or usual price of the product. So, this is the price that is followed by the smaller firms. So, the next one is the trade association pricing. Um, So the firm frequently comes to the implied or express agreements to maintain the prices at a similar level. So there are certain associations or certain groups that will come to an agreement based of the pricing of their products. So the third one is the customary pricing. So there are prices that are that tends to be fixed, or uh, tend to be fixed more or less in the minds of the consumers, and this price is called charm price. So uh, the in this case, the consumers are the one who mostly determine the price of the product. So the fourth one is the price leadership. This is somewhat related to the going rate pricing, wherein there's a price leader, and this leader is the one who determines the price of that product. Next, the last one for the competition-oriented pricing is the sale bid pricing, wherein um, there's what you call a tender, uh, which is a quote price determined by contracting firms. So, next slide, please. So, we'll move on to the demand oriented pricing. So, the first one is the differential pricing or price discrimination. So, there are several bases on which the open price discrimination is practiced. The first one is the time price differentials, wherein the price is determined based on the based on time because not um, because the demand may shift based on the time. So, for example, in cases of Christmas, so in cases of holidays like Christmas, uh, the demand for toys, uh, the demand for toys will be high. So, the business and the industry will take this into consideration and usually increase the price of toys. So the next one is the use price differential. So this differential is will be based on the different buyers which have different uses of a product or a service. The third one is the quality price differential. So in this case, the quality of the product will determine the price of um, the product. So if the buyer this will also this will also is determined by the buyer's understanding of the quality of that product. So if the because there's some cases wherein buyers understand that a higher quality product will also indicate a higher price, and they will still choose that product because it will be used for a long period of time. So the last basis is the quantity differential, wherein the seller discriminates on the basis of the quantity of the product. So this usually is happens on wholesales, wherein the seller uh, would apply or would refer to the quantity of the product for its price. The second is the for the demand oriented pricing is the perceived value pricing. When we say perceived value pricing, it refers to the fixing the price on the basis of a buyer's perception of the value of that product. So next slide, please. Next, we have the pricing based on other economic consideration. So there are four. The first one is the administered pricing, wherein the government is the one who will enforce or uh, I mean who will enforce the product and this prices rather, and these prices are fixed. So there are certain characteristics of administered prices. First, we have the they're fixed by the government. Second, they are statutory. The third one is they are regulatory in nature. Next is they're meant as corrective measures. And fifth, they are the outcome of the price policy of the government. So the next one is dual pricing. When we say dual pricing, it is a system in which there are two prices for the same commodity at the same time. So the first one is the controlled price, which is fixed by the government, and the other is the free market price, which is based on the condition of the demand and supply. So the controlled price, this is a fixed price because again it is fixed by the government, so it cannot be changed, while the free market price is a fluctuating price, so it can be changed. So the next one is shadow pricing. When we say um shadow pricing, it is an estimated price for shadow price rather. It is an estimated price for something that is not normally priced or sold in the market. So uh, these are imputed values. So when we say imputed values, so these are the assumed or um, oh yes, assumed value given to an item when the actual value is not known or available. So basically, yes, it is assumed. So the last one is multiple price product pricing. So in a single firm, it's not all the time that they have different um, they have the same products rather. So for example, in a refrigerator uh production in refrigerator production. So there are different types of refrigerators. There are dual two doors and one door refrigerator. So the industry will take that into consideration in pricing their products. So that is all for my report. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I am Lei Pingkang, and I will be presenting the fourth and last category of the main pricing practices, which is the pricing policies based on market conditions. So under this category, there are four pricing policies, and the first would be perfect competition. So again, pure or perfect competition is a theoretical market structure in which all firms sell an identical product, the product being a commodity or being homogeneous, and buyers have complete or perfect information in the past, present, and future about the product being sold and the prices charged by each firm. So, in a perfectly competitive market, all firms are price takers, so they cannot influence the market price of their product. Hence, a firm can only sell its product at market price and nothing above it. So, in the long run, the sales price is just equal to the average cost, normal profit is made, and there is no excess profits. Next slide, please. So the second pricing policy would be that under a monopoly market situation. So a monopoly refers to when a company and its product offerings dominate a sector or industry. A firm enjoys monopoly position only because it has succeeded in eliminating or absorbing its competitors. So a de facto monopoly must prepare to defend itself against first the emergence of substitute competitors. So to prevent the entry of new firms, a monopolist must set entry preventing prices to discourage new firms from entering that particular branch or of industry. And second, competition of substitute products. The monopoly must establish a policy on the basis of a demand curve that will take its products into account. As in the case where the uses of products produced by a monopoly are many, the degree of monopoly can vary enormously from one use to another. So, in other words, if its products have a variety of uses and the demand curve for each use varies, it should take into account factors such as the level of competitiveness in the market for pricing the products. The next would be pricing policies under a temporary monopoly. This type of market occurs more frequently than that of a monopoly. So this is a market in which a firm invents a new product and places it on the market, and for quite some time, the demand will remain low since customers are not yet aware of the product. And as the product enters into common usage, demand develops rapidly and additional firms try to enter the market and they develop new production methods. Gradually, prices and production techniques stabilize and the market evolves towards an ordinarily competitive one. So the firm that invents a new product must determine a strategy to maximize effective income, and they may consider two extreme cases, one of which would be scheming of demand, in which the producer sets a high introductory price to attract buyers with a strong desire for the product and the resources to buy it, and then gradually reduce the price to attract the next and subsequent layers of the market. And the other one would be creating a demand market, which is a process by which marketers get people excited about a new brand or product to generate demand. Next slide, please. The fourth pricing policy is the scheming price policy. This applies to when the product is new but with a high degree of consumer acceptability. So the firm may decide to charge a high markup and therefore charge a high price. Reasons for adopting a high markup and therefore high initial price would be when the demand for the new product is relatively inelastic. So this means that the high prices will not stop the new consumers from demanding the product. Second, if the life of the product promises to be a short one, so management fixes a high price so that it can get as much profit as possible in as short a period as possible. Third, if the firm can divide the market into different segments based on different elasticities. And last, where there is a heavy investment of capital and when the costs of introducing a new product are high. And next slide, please. The next would be pricing policies under a duopoly, which is a case where there are only two firms in an industry. So in this type of market, each duopolist can choose his production in such a way as to maximize his income for a given value of output. And each duopolist has no interest in modifying his behavior as long as the other does not modify his. So with a duopoly, each company will tend to compete against the other, keeping prices lower and benefiting consumers. However, since there are only two major players in the industry, there is some likelihood that a monopoly could be formed. This means that duopolists can eliminate their competitors through price wars or through agreements, and therefore this makes it difficult for other competitors to enter the industry and gain market share. The next are pricing policies under an oligopoly. An oligopoly is a market structure with a small number of firms, none of which can keep the others from having significant influence. They avoid price wars or they refrain from seeking to increase their share of the market through price cuts, since they are aware that their rivals can do the same. As a result, this market structure can attain a certain stability through price leadership of a firm, reduction in hidden prices, and non-price competition. Next slide, please. And the last would be monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition is an industry in which many firms offer products or services that are similar but not perfect substitutes. Barriers to entry and exit in a monopolistic competitive industry are low, and the decisions of any one firm do not directly affect those of its competitors. Price policies in this type of market are extremely varied because of product differentiation, and each firm is faced with a separate demand curve and market price. Next slide, please. The last topic would be the role of demand in pricing decisions. So we all know that the degree of a buyer's demand sensitivity to price changes is an important consideration in making pricing decisions, as this can have an effect on sales volume and revenue. Next slide, please. So first, market versus firm elasticity. So price elasticity of demand is again a measure of the degree to which buyers are sensitive to price changes. So in any market characterized by several functionally substitutable products, there are actually two demand schedules. The first being primary demand or demand for the general product, in which an increase in aggregate demand means increase in demand for the product of all firms. The second demand schedule is secondary demand or the demand for the firm's specific offering, which is the demand for goods or services produced by only one firm, and in general, this demand schedule is found to be more price elastic than the primary demand. The next would be demand for buyers' output. The market for buyers' products may actually be price elastic. So a reduction in price by a firm would rise demand for its products. Hence, manufacturers selling to such buyers and whose product represents a significant portion of these buyers' product costs may curtail sales opportunities by eliminating discounts or low margin products. Next slide, please. The third would be likelihood of competitive entry. An emphasis on high price strategies may encourage the entry of competitors, especially when entry barriers are low and when demand is price elastic. Moreover, high prices or rapidly increasing prices may force buyers to consider their need and perhaps actively seek out competitive substitutes. Lastly, demand consequences of a product line. So, most firms sell a wide variety of products requiring a variety of different marketing strategies. And within a product line, there are usually some products that are functional substitutes or complementaries for each other. So pricing a product line could become a major challenge because of these demand interrelationships. And these demand interrelationships, coupled with there being usually several price market targets. Um, next slide, please. And that is all for the report of Group 2. Thank you.